In the dawn of the 17th century, ships bearing the first English settlers carved their way across the unforgiving Atlantic, driven by dreams of wealth and new beginnings. The year was 1607, when the battered colonists established Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. A harsh and unyielding wilderness awaited them, but their spirits burned with hope. A second group of settlers to colonize would come in 1620, arriving much further north in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Behind their venture lay the principles of mercantilism, an economic system that promised prosperity through controlled trade and resource extraction. The colonies, in theory, would be self-sufficient territories, providing raw materials to feed the coffers of England, while receiving finished goods in return. To secure this vision, the settlers implemented a communal system. Land was owned collectively, and grain was stored in a common warehouse to be shared by all. The idea was simple: work together, share the bounty, and thrive. But what seemed sensible in theory quickly unraveled in practice. With resources held in common, no one felt the pressing need to work harder than their neighbor. Laziness and resentment crept in. The colony's food supplies dwindled, and the promise of abundance became a nightmare of scarcity. Hunger spread like a plague, and desperation took hold. The settlers, reduced to gnawing on shoe leather and rats, faced a grim reality. Nearly half of their number perished from starvation and disease. Then came Captain John Smith, a man hardened by adversity and unafraid to confront the brutal truth. Recognizing that the socialist model of shared resources was dooming the colony, he tore down the failed system and replaced it with something radical: personal responsibility. Each colonist received their own parcel of land to cultivate and call their own. "He that will not work shall not eat," Smith declared, enforcing a principle that would become foundational to the American spirit. Under this new structure, productivity soared. Faced with the prospect of owning the fruits of their labor, the settlers thrived. They had learned the hard way that when everyone is entitled to everything, no one feels responsible for anything. The lesson was seared into their memory, one that would echo throughout the generations. Meanwhile, across the ocean, England watched its colonies grow with a greedy eye. To bolster its mercantilist ambitions, the Crown imposed heavy taxes and trade restrictions designed to drain wealth from the colonies without offering them any voice in Parliament. The very economic freedom that had saved the colonies from starvation was now under siege by their own government. But the settlers had tasted freedom, and they would not easily surrender it. As resentment brewed and calls for independence grew louder, the stage was set for a revolution. The ideals born out of Jamestown's struggle would fuel the fight for liberty and shape the identity of a new nation. By 1680, the English colonies along the Atlantic were no longer fragile outposts. They were growing fast. In New England, seaports bustled with trade. In the middle colonies, golden fields of wheat fed towns and cities. And in the south, tobacco, rice, and indigo covered the land like green gold. But this prosperity came at a cost: labor cost. At first, colonists relied on indentured servants from Europe, but landowners wanted something permanent and sustainable. And so entered the opportunity to take advantage of the transatlantic slave trade system. By the early 1700s, slavery was the very engine of the colonies. Tobacco from Virginia, rice and indigo from the Carolinas, even New England merchants profited, building ships for the trade and refining sugar from the Caribbean. The Atlantic economy was being shaped. From New England went ships of rum, textiles, and firearms, and in came ships of enslaved African through the horrific Middle Passage. This wasn't just an American story, it was global, and yet, as colonists grew wealthy, a paradox emerged. They read the Enlightenment, they spoke of liberty, rights, and independence, but many, including Washington, Jefferson, Madison, built their fortunes on enslaved labor. Voices of resistance rose: Quakers in Pennsylvania, early abolitionists in New England. Still in the South, slavery was defended as essential. The colonies cried, "No taxation without representation," but nearly 20% of their population remained enslaved, denied all representation, denied all liberty. When revolution came in 1776, slavery shaped it at every turn. Britain offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped their patriot masters. Tens of thousands fled, seizing their own chance at liberty. The revolution's rhetoric of freedom cracked open America's deepest contradiction. A new nation would be born, but its foundation still rested on bondage. All of it carried the weight of enslaved African lives. The colonists won independence, but the paradox of liberty and bondage would haunt the nation for generations to come. In the mid-18th century, tensions between Great Britain and its American colonies began to intensify. The British government, burdened by debts from the costly Seven Years' War, 1756-1763, turned to its colonies for revenue, implementing a series of taxes that sparked widespread resentment. The Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to pay for an official stamp on paper goods, was seen as an overreach of authority, as the colonies had no representation in Parliament, giving rise to the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." Though the act was repealed, it was soon followed by other unpopular measures like the Townshend Acts, which taxed essentials such as glass, paper, and tea. These growing grievances galvanized colonial resistance. In 1770, tensions boiled over with the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 civilians. Though British troops were acquitted, the event fueled anti-British sentiment. The 1773 Tea Act further inflamed tempers by granting the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales, undercutting local merchants. In defiance, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor, a bold act of protest known as the Boston Tea Party. In retaliation, the British imposed the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, which included closing Boston's port and revoking Massachusetts' charter. These punitive measures united the colonies in opposition, leading to the First Continental Congress in 1774, where delegates coordinated a response and affirmed colonial rights. As British troops marched to seize colonial arms in Lexington and Concord in April 1775, armed conflict erupted, marking the beginning of the Revolutionary War. What had begun as protests against taxation had transformed into a full-blown struggle for independence. In 1776, the American colonies took a historic leap by declaring independence from Great Britain with the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson. This bold move came amid the Revolutionary War, which was already underway. The war united 13 distinct colonies under a common cause, the pursuit of self-government and freedom from monarchical rule. Though initially outmatched, the Continental Army, led by George Washington, gained crucial support from France, helping turn the tide at key battles such as Saratoga in 1777, and ultimately Yorktown in 1781. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally ended the conflict, granting the United States full independence in significant Western territory. America won its independence in 1776, but by 1787, the country was a mess. A confused collection of states trying to figure out how to run itself. The Articles of Confederation, the country's first attempt at government, was failing hard. Why? Because it gave the states so much power, and the national government so little, that Congress couldn't even collect taxes to pay off war debt or raise an army. It was like trying to run a business where each department just did whatever it wanted. Something had to change, and fast. In Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention is held to fix the Articles, but it quickly becomes clear they need to start from scratch. The result? The U.S. Constitution, a brand new blueprint for government that gives the federal government much more power while trying to keep it from becoming tyrannical. But there was a problem. Not everyone is on board. Some people, called anti-federalists, are worried this new constitution will create a powerful central government that will trample all over their rights, just like King George III did. They want more protections for individual rights and states' powers. This launched the Federalist Papers. From 1787 to 1788, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote 85 essays under the pen name Publius. Their goal? To convince New York and other states to ratify the new Constitution. The essays were published in newspapers and later collected into a book called The Federalist. Their arguments were clear, sharp, and often brutally honest about why the Articles of Confederation didn't work and why the Constitution was necessary. The Federalist Papers covered 3 key themes. 1. Separation of powers. The founders were terrified of tyranny. They wanted to make sure no single part of government could have too much power. In Federalist No. 51, Madison wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were governing men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary." His point? People aren't perfect, so government needs to be carefully structured with checks and balances. 2. A strong but limited federal government, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, argued that a stronger central government was essential for national defense, economic stability, and unity. In Federalist Number 23, Hamilton explained that the government must have enough power to ensure national security. The circumstances that endanger the safety of nations are infinite, and no constitutional shackles can wisely be imposed on the power to which the care of it is committed. And 3. Judicial review and the courts. In Federalist Number 78, Hamilton described the judicial branch as the least dangerous, because it had no influence over either the sword or the purse. He explained that the courts would interpret laws but could not enforce them. They were meant to be neutral interpreters of the law, not rulers. Despite the Federalist Papers' persuasive arguments, anti-federalists weren't convinced. They wanted explicit protections for individual rights. To secure ratification, James Madison promised that once the Constitution was approved, a Bill of Rights would be added, and he kept that promise. In 1791, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights, were ratified, guaranteeing essential freedoms like speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to a fair trial. The Federalist Papers did more than just sell the Constitution. They explained it. They laid out the logic and principles in the design of an American government that we live on to be the most admired and richest country in the world. Despite its groundbreaking framework, the Constitution was far from perfect and shaped by compromises. Many older generations Americans cringe when they hear the phrase, the 3/5 compromise. For generations, the subculture narrative was that it referred to being 3/5 of a person, and this would not be entirely accurate. The compromise was never about human worth or dignity. It was about political representation and taxation. After independence, the framers faced a huge problem. How would states be represented in Congress? Should enslaved people who had no rights and could not vote count toward a state's population total? Southern states wanted them counted fully, to boost their seats in Congress and power in the Electoral College. Northern states objected. Why should a state gain political power from people it denied basic rights? In came the compromise. The solution came in Article 1, Section 2. For apportioning seats in the House of Representatives and calculating direct taxes, each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person. This reduced the political advantage of the slaveholding South, but still gave them more power than if enslaved people hadn't been counted at all. It was a political deal, not a judgment of worth. James Madison explained the reasoning in Federalist Number 54. He acknowledged the paradox. Enslaved people were considered property by Southern laws, yet also persons in the eyes of government, subject to laws and punishments. Counting them as 3/5 was the middle ground, an uncomfortable but necessary bargain to preserve unity between North and South. As Madison put it, the Constitution had to reflect this dual reality. Government is instituted no less for the protection of the property than of the persons of individuals. In other words, it wasn't saying a black man is 3/5 of a man, but about resolving the clash between representation and property. In Federalist 55, Madison takes on another fear. Would unequal representation corrupt the system? As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities, which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. He argued that even imperfect compromises could serve the Republic, if anchored by systems that could improve over time. The compromise gave the South disproportionate influence in early American politics. For decades it tilted presidential elections and congressional debates, delaying the fight over slavery. But it also planted seeds of division that erupted in the Civil War. By the 14th Amendment, 1868, the compromise was erased. All persons, regardless of race, were to be fully counted in representation. Following the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, political divisions quickly emerged in the fledgling republic. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton represented two contrasting visions for the country. Jefferson, advocating for agrarianism and a decentralized government, led what became the Democratic Republican Party. He championed the rights of states and feared the concentration of federal power. Hamilton, on the other hand, envisioned a strong central government with a focus on commerce and industry, giving rise to the Federalist Party. These ideological divides shaped early American governance and led to a heated rivalry during the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams Jefferson's election in 1800, dubbed the Revolution of 1800, marked the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties in U.S. history, from Federalist to Democratic Republican. His presidency ushered in an era where the ideals of limited government and westward expansion took precedence. He reduced the size of the military, cut taxes, and famously orchestrated the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, doubling the size of the United States. Despite his party's skepticism of centralized authority, Jefferson used presidential power pragmatically, navigating between principle and necessity. His successors, James Madison and James Monroe, continued Democratic-Republican dominance, culminating in the so-called Era of Good Feelings, a period of political harmony following the decline of the Federalist Party. However, this political calm was short-lived. The 1820s brought new conflicts over economic policy, states' rights, and the balance of power. The Democratic-Republican Party splintered as factions formed around different leaders and ideas. Andrew Jackson, a military hero and populist figure, emerged as a symbol of a new democratic ethos. He appealed directly to the common man, challenging elite political norms. The election of 1828 unleashed a new political force, Jacksonian democracy. It celebrated the common man, distrusted banks and Eastern elites, and championed westward expansion, even when that meant displacing native nations and extending slavery. But Jackson's power also awakened his rivals. The Whig Party rose in opposition, rallying behind leaders like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, defending Congress, commerce, and moral reform. As America's territory stretched westward, so too did its divisions. Every new state brought the burning question, would it be free or slave? Compromises tried and failed. Economic transformations, immigration waves, and abolitionist voices swelled the tensions. By the 1850s, the Whigs had fractured, and from the chaos emerged a new political movement, one that stood firmly against the spread of slavery into new territories. This was the birth of the Republican Party, setting the stage for a national conflict that would test and revolutionize the Union.